welcome everyone to Chewing Gum for the Ears, where music, tech and retro meet. I am Steve Litchfield and I'm recording this on the Thursday, the 16th of November 2017. This is all about, as you say, music and favourite albums, tracks, artists, etc. from the years gone by. With me to discuss all of that, first of all, I have Ted Salmon.
Hello everyone, hope you can hear me. I'm sitting on top of the landed no great orm. No, not really. We seem to have a Wi-Fi outage, so I'm on my phone and we'll do our best. Hello everyone.
Yes, from the dimmest, darkest, least connected Wales, but we'll persevere. Also with us we have our special guest for this particular episode, Tim Evans. Hi Tim.
Hello there everybody.
Whereabouts are you?
I am in just outside of Banbury in Oxfordshire, just in a little village.
Okay, and the usual format, people know it by now, but the show notes will be up at stevelitchfield.com/music, and also our wonderful PodHub UK portal where you can find all the different podcasts we do. One of the features of all our podcasts, of course, is that we do like to include the community, and we do have a wonderful Google Plus community for Chewing Gum for the Ears. So Ted, what's in there?
Yeah, we do. And don't forget to head across there and join in. Lots of stuff being talked about, including from John Campion, feeding back from last show when we were talking about Autobahn, which is the obviously the Kraftwerk album. He spotted this thing in SoundCloud. He says that one of the members of Cold Cut has a side project in which he collects Kraftwerk covers and then releases them as mixes. And you've got to go, link in the show notes, you've got to go and listen to that. It's really entertaining. And this guy has just kind of patched all this stuff together and turned it into some sort of mix. There are 8 so far, he says, so head for that one. He's also brought up this other band which I've never heard of, I'm sad to say, called Mogwai, and a new album called Every Country's Son. There's a link in the show notes to that with that as well. He says, I mentioned how excited I was about this release in my last post, and boy, does this deliver. For a band on their 9th studio album, Mogwai have somehow distilled what they do into this wonderful collection of 11 tracks whilst making it sound as fresh and exciting as the first stuff that of theirs that I heard. So if you like post-rock, now apparently post-rock, this is a Scottish band they are, and apparently post-rock is a experimental rock characterized, Wikipedia says, by the influence and use of instruments commonly associated with rock music, but using rhythms not traditionally found in rock. So it sounded a bit kind of prog rockish to me. And anyway, link in the show notes. Go and have a listen, everyone. And thank you, John, for chipping in there. Don't forget to head across to the community and do chip in. Now, before we move on to Tim, I've got a couple of things I just wanted to highlight from what's around at the moment and what I've noticed coming up. Midge Ure has got a new album out called Orchestrated, and you can actually access a couple of tracks on that if you dig around online. Coming out on the 1st of December, 10 quid. I mean, many of us remember Midge Ure from the kind of 1980s, and I from listening to these 2 tracks, it sounds very mature, and I think that some of these kind of musicians, as they get older, just kind of mellow out and create some really interesting composed pieces of music. So have a listen to that if you get the opportunity. The other thing I wanted to mention, which will be much more up your street, Steve, is The End by Black Sabbath. A celebration of Black Sabbath's final hometown concert at Birmingham's Genting Arena on the 4th of February 2017. I think we might have mentioned it at the time, actually, when it was going on. But that's coming out on a CD, and if anyone wants to buy that, 16 quid, out on the 17th of December. Should be out by the time you hear this. So, yes, Black Sabbath is there. And the other thing that I wanted to just say is that I found this new artist this month called Cœur de Pirate. And she's got a lovely voice, and we might come back to her later in homework. But there's a lovely album called Child of Light, which was actually a soundtrack she wrote for a video game, which is very interesting. Link in the show notes to that. Beautiful composition, really nice piano playing, haunting themes, delightful. And that's kicking about at the moment. Link in the show notes. Do head across there. So thank you very much, everyone, for chipping in your thoughts, and keep it going. Google Plus is the community. You'll find us. Just search for Chewing Gum for the Ears.
Well, you may be surprised at this, Ted, but of the three new worth a listen tracks there and albums, I think the Black Sabbath one is the least likely to please me. I'm not a huge Black Sabbath fan. On the other hand, I'm a big Midge fan, and that what you've just said about Coeur de Pirate, I hope that's pronounced right, that sounds wonderful, so I'm really keen to look at that as well. So, thanks for the picks.
Excellent. Well, we'll come back to her in the homework later on.
Okay, and let's go to our guest then, Tim Evans, and what he's been listening to for the last 30 years, apart from somebody's ringtone and notification sound. Oh, shut up, whoever it is.
Yes, that's fine. Yeah, sorry about that.
Tim, never mind, that actually fits in quite well, that sound, with some of the music you like from the 1980s. So what was the very first record or CD you ever bought?
The very first record I bought was, which goes back an awful long time, was Gary Newman, and it's I think every decade is defined musically about when you have the ability to go and buy your own records, and it was The Pleasure Principle by Gary Newman. So lots of slick back hair and lots of synthesizers, which when it gets to my music, I think is probably the way that most of my music goes, is electronic or whatever it is. But yeah, Gary Newman, thumping bass and a synthesized background. Loved it, and ever since then I've spent quite a lot of time listening to a lot of Gary Newman, and that's probably when I get into a few other records, recordings, you'll probably see there's a sort of trend there. But I always go back to it. I always try and keep up with his stuff, and go off and try and see him as much as I can. He's just done another tour, so he changes his stance a little bit from time to time, going from being brilliant to rubbish and back again. But so that was the first one.
We highlighted, I think, his new album, didn't we, on the last show? And people were kind of linking out to that, and they were all saying it's a very, very good album. Yeah,
it's not bad. And but then again, I think with Gary Newman, you could probably pick 4 or 5 albums that you can't listen to as well. So right. He's one of those that, if anybody ever said, "Oh, it's just brilliant," or everything is brilliant, that's not really the case. I think he lost his way a little bit. But again, I'm sure that's the same for all artists.
Yeah, for me, this kind of music is a time and stamp place. Not particularly on my list of stuff to listen to, but it reminds me of a time in the 80s, and electronica kind of stuff was. It feels a bit dated now, but actually, if you were there and you lived it, and it was part of your upbringing, we go back yet again to that kind of nostalgic thing, and it appeals to me because of that.
Yeah, and the thing that sticks out most for me on that is that I was around that age where I was just because I was brought up in a village. I don't know about you guys, but I was brought up in a village, and when you're brought up in a village in the UK, 1978. 80, 81, you either got into heavy metal, because that was the only music that village halls seemed to have, or you had to go further afield, and further afield took me into London, and so I was very fortunate that I could go and see what I thought were the best groups or whatever in that period of time, which is reflected by the music that I love, I suppose, and it really did stamp me at that point. And nothing's changed since then, I suppose. Sound a bit old about it all, but I think that's just the way it is. So I was slightly different, because when I was growing up, I was never at home for anything that would be that type of music that all my friends liked. So I was always the odd one out, I think.
Last time I saw Gary Newman, he was at about 1,000 feet up in the air. Because one of his hobbies, as you know, Tim, is flying airplanes. And I last saw him flying, I think it was a World War II fighter plane, doing a display at an air show. So, interesting chap.
Yeah, very. And there's a good, there was a good documentary on I don't know if you have Sky. Sky Arts do some very good documentaries about quite a lot of different groups and personalities and things. And they do, I think most of them you can probably see them on YouTube, but there was a really good one about Gary Newman who spoke very candidly about losing his way, and all the fans turning against him, because it's just the way, isn't it, when you get so much. I mean, Gary Newman back at 1978-79 was a phenomenal success very quickly, and if you, I mean, as you'll see in my other things that I like, if you like synthesizer music, then there's a great documentary called Synth Britannia. It was on the BBC.
Yeah.
And there's one bit where I can't remember who it was, but somebody was saying that the whole group of people that had been brought up with, they were going to be new romantics, they were going to be taking on all of this electronic music, it was going to be something brand new, and then all of a sudden Gary Newman turns up and he's number one all over the place, and nobody knew who he was, and he was sort of ostracized by a whole selection of his peers, plus a whole selection of people that were music aficionados, if you will. So it's just quite an interesting story to me, but I loved it at the time, definitely.
Yeah, the Sky Art stuff is also available on Now TV, which a lot of people have got subscriptions to on internet sources, so it's worth looking for it there as well.
Yeah.
I bought this Pleasure Principle on cassette back in the day, at least, and I still like a couple of the tracks, though I can't shake the overall impression, really, of Newman's writing, as you intimated there, that each album has some classics and an awful lot of filler in between.
Yeah, definitely.
My favourite Gary Newman stuff is still the very first album, when the Tubeway Army still had guitars, so Replicas, the album, and the single Me I Disconnect From You really excited me back in the day, but just my opinion.
Yeah.
Let's move on with your top six, though. Your top six, or most interesting 6 albums of all time. At number 6, and you are allowed to use the full title. I know this is a family-friendly show, but I think you'll get away with it. Introduce number 6, Tim.
So number 6, which I call my second favourite album at number 6, is Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols, or Sex Pistols. Just in the first track. And this goes back to documentaries again. If you ever see it, there's a great quote by Noel Gallagher, ex of Oasis, who was asked about what's his favourite album ever, and this is his favourite album ever, for the simple reason that I love it, which is the first 20 seconds of it, when Holidays in the Sun plays, and it's just. When I heard it, and I wasn't old enough to actually buy it and go out and get it myself, but when I first heard this, it just changed everything. I just had to start collecting vinyl, as we call it now, but I just had to start collecting records there and then. I couldn't get hold of this at the time, but I just went for it after that, and ever since then, on my iPod or on my Walkman or whatever it may be, this is one of the very first ones that I pick up.
Yeah. Amazing energy. Yeah, I'll go with my positive take on it before I hand over to Ted. I bought this on cassette and then later on CD. The story behind the recording is that this wall of sound that completely takes you over in the first 10 seconds, as you've said, it's just incredible energy, came from Steve Jones, the guitarist who I like. Basically, I think it's Sid Vicious, just wasn't around or was totally stoned, unable to play. It sounds about right, doesn't it? So he did, not only did all the guitars, but he did all the bass. And because he couldn't play bass, he'd never played bass before in his life, he just played the guitar chords on the bass. So you had this incredible thrasher in a good way, because it's just incredibly tight, because it's just him playing along with himself, if you like. And the drums drumming in the Sex Pistols was always top notch as well. I really rated that as well. So the combination of Steve Jones doubled up plus the drums was a really, really tight, energetic sound. And I completely agree with you. It's a brilliant album, with the obvious caveat that it's punk rock and that some of the songwriting is a bit iffy, but the sheer energy, the sheer passion. I mean, you crank the volume up high, away from Ted Salmon, of course, and you can marvel at an album that absolutely encapsulated the energy and the anarchy of punk in 1977. And yeah, I still play it regularly.
Yeah. You don't need to keep it away from me. I mean, it's just it's nostalgia. Okay, yes, I have become not liking of loud noises in my ears, but actually this was my time as well, and I remember this, and I at the time I thought I wanted to be in with it all and be a part of this kind of punk thing, but and I listened to it, and I wasn't really into it in the sense of going and dressing up and being a part of the scene, but it was certainly on my radar, and I listened to it very, very closely. But now, I just can't now. It's really interesting to go back and visit it, but I wouldn't want to be playing that every day.
Yeah, I've just looked it up. It's Paul Cook was the drummer in the Sex Pistols, so I've given him a name check. So yeah, Paul Cook and Steve Jones between them produce a really thunderous wall of sound. So yeah, highly recommend it. We'll put links to all of these, by the way. Everything we're talking about in the show, we'll put in the show notes at stevelitchfield.com/music. Now, your number 5 pick, introduce it, please, Tim.
Yeah, so my number 5 is Dare by Human League, which... and my number 5 and 4 and 3 probably have stories attached to them. And these albums, these are not because they're the best in the world. But Dare, for me, introduced this idea of that men first of all can wear makeup, and that's a good thing, which I know sounds a bit bizarre, but again that comes back to getting out of the village and doing that sort of thing. But really it was the idea of first of all hearing something of a sequencer actually working. I didn't know what a sequencer was at the time, but it was a very rudimentary arpeggiator that was working in the background for this album. And there was another one that was produced after this called the League Unlimited Orchestra, which was remixes of these, which I thought was better. And it all stemmed from there in terms of what I thought that electronic and dance music might become. And I loved every second of it, and second being the track from there, which I think is the best one. And yeah, it's just to me, again, it's a timestamp, as Ted would probably quite rightly point out. And if today you were to produce it, it would sound very underproduced. But that raw electronic energy, again, just sticks out for me.
And if I heard it for the first time now, I'm not sure what I'd make of it. I'd like to think that I would like it because at the time I did love it. But we always go back on this show to actually say, is this a test of time? Is this, we can't possibly answer that question about hearing it for the first time again. But laying that aside, this is a musically interesting album. There's really good, solid vocal performances, I think. And there's clear Bowie influences. I know I keep going back to Bowie, but there are clear influences in the vocal performances, I think. Hard to pick out tracks. Yes, I like Seconds, but I like all of them, I think. Maybe Darkness. I very much like the track Darkness. The whole album is just nostalgia again and right in the right time for me.
Now, I have to say, I have said on this podcast before, the 1980s were kind of my lost decade. It was the decade when music went south because the guitars got abandoned. So I do apologise for some of my comments here. This is purely, Tim, this is purely subjective, purely my own opinions.
That's perfectly okay. You can't help being liking guitars. It's an affliction. But I'll let you off on that.
But having gone
that's good. That's good because you can listen to things for the first time.
Yeah. So having gone from Nevermind the Bollocks to Dared by the Human League, it's really, it just wasn't my era. The sounds, because it's all synthesizers from the 1980s, it just sounds dated to me. It sounds like I'm back in the 1980s. Now, having said that, the songs are better than I remember them. I remember them being fairly amateurish and trivial, but this is clearly one of the classier albums, and there are some good songs here. But I'm sorry, personally I would not choose to listen to this in 2017.
Fair enough.
But moving on, exactly the same genre. And I should mention, by the way, that I'm convinced Tim's left his phone not on silent, so that the electronic notification noises fit in perfectly with his theme. But there we are.
Probably.
Introduce number 4.
Number 4. Well, you're not going to like this one much more.
No.
So this is by Soft Cell. So Non-Stop Erotic Cabaret by Soft Cell. And there's, the track Say Hello, Wave Goodbye. A lot of people just think of Tainted Love, but Say Hello, Wave Goodbye is just a brilliant song. But the reason that this is there is because this is when I broke up with my first serious girlfriend, and this is the song that I played constantly after that. And there's a theme going through here, I think. But it's just to me, it's just this idea of just brilliant songs that maybe they're synthesizers there, of course, and there's some edge to it as well. There's a track on there called Sex Dwarf, which is Just again, for the time, it does sound a dated track in terms of musically, but the content is just something nobody had ever heard before, really, especially around where I come from. So it was a big deal. But yeah, Say Hello, Wave Goodbye, I always think is fantastic. And it was reproduced again by David Gray about 10 years ago or so, and he did a good version of it as well. But most people forget the fact that it came from that album.
Ted?
Yeah, I'm not so familiar with this kind of soft cell thing. But I mean, I was aware of it being around. I used to run a disco at the time, so I was always playing the hits. What annoyed me about this soft cell thing was really the kind of the camp voice going through, the lyrics. It just sounded as though it was very forced, and especially the high notes, which sometimes he was missing anyway. It just didn't sound as though musically he was very up there, and it was all done on Vogue and on social status and what was kind of the kind of fashion scene at the time, and the music was almost secondary. It was all this kind of camp thing that was going on, but I mean the music was okay and some of the hits were great, but it's not anything like Human League in my opinion.
Yeah, enough with the 80s electropop, I say, enough. But having said that, Tim, I've just remembered that back in that sort of era, I had a favourite track, and it was by Visage. I'm sure you remember them, and the hit was Fade to Grey, which is one of my favourite tracks of all time, so I can't dismiss this genre completely.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great track, and also you said you like Mesjur. What about Vienna? That's all part of the same genre, isn't it? So you do like some of it, you see.
I know. I wasn't totally lifeless during the 80s. I just had a bit of a wobbly. Introduce your number 3 to Tim.
Yeah. So this one picks it up a little bit. It's still an 80s track, but this is Music for the Masses by Depeche Mode, or Depeche Mode, as my American friends call them still. And this was a difficult one because I'm a big fan of Depeche Mode, especially their 90s albums like Violator and then Ultra, where they changed a little bit. This was probably the last of the synthesizer type of Depeche Mode that a lot of people have gotten used to in the 80s before they changed into, which they still use synthesizers now, of course, but there's a lot more guitar, a lot more normal drums and things like that in their current music, and probably the music that they've been producing for 20 years or more. And this one especially is the first time I was in America and I actually saw them live when this album was out. And it was, I just think, very, very cool electronic, bringing it together, and it was the epitome of that. And then after that, I think maybe electro pop, as we've got down here, or synthesizer pop, is probably finished by that point. And this was probably the last hurrah of that, and still holds a place in my heart. But to be honest with you, if you swapped it for Violator or Ultra, I wouldn't be disappointed.
Ted?
Yeah, this is. I think I hear what you're saying, because this to me seems like smart and intelligent electronic music. It's considered and often mellow, and it's not just like the others we've spoken about already many times. They're just kind of following the Hit Factory formula, and in this there's kind of strong vocals and solid tunes, and it's more like real music and not just the kind of fashion of the day and jumping on the bandwagon. I'm not particularly familiar with this album, but certainly the earlier work of Depeche Mode and the singles, I was familiar with those. So I shall certainly listen to some of the albums now. I know actually they're still touring. I can't possibly be the same lineup, is it? Or perhaps it is.
It is the same line. Well, it's the same lineup minus. Over the time, they've lost one person, gained one person, lost one person. So Vince Clarke was originally in the group, and then he left to do Yazoo, and then somebody else joined, and the guy who joined was quite a good normal musician, whereas the other guys in the group would probably never say that they were musicians from the off. And he left probably around about the end of this album, actually, the time of the album, he left. And ever since then, it's been picked up, and it's been picked up by the original members still. There was a stage just before Ultra, I believe, where the lead singer, Dave Gahan, I think his name is, I think he nearly died. In fact, he did die, and they have to bring him back because he took a drugs overdose, and he was dead for something like 10 minutes or something ridiculous, I'm not sure. And so essentially it is the original lineup still. There's three of them. They've been in the band since day one, and that's what it is. Yeah.
Very good.
So not only have they managed to keep the same lineup more or less over 3 decades, they've even got one person who's come back from the dead. And I think that's pretty impressive in the pantheon of rock lineups. I like to quote Hawkwind, who I've kind of followed for about 4 decades now, who have gone through 117 members in that time. So well done, Depeche Mode. Anyway, I did like the music for the masses. It's still electro pop, but it's got a heavier, more experimental edge, and I appreciated that. Definitely some interesting tracks, most of which I'd not heard before. Now, we are going to run short on time, so we're going to rush through this, but number 2, introduce it, please.
Number 2 is Blade Runner OST by Vangelis, simply because of simply because of the synthesizers. And the synthesizers that are there, I have a couple of them in real life sitting in my studio, and I can still sit there and basically perform most of this stuff. Not very well, but I can do it. and I just love that soundscape as it goes. That's what it is.
Yeah, you probably had to be there to kind of appreciate this and know the film and like the film. I wasn't, and I didn't. This is a bit lost on me. Listening to it now kind of confirms what I think, really. The soundscape and the talking clips would mean much more to me if I knew what was going on visually. And Vangelis does tend to churn out quite samey stuff when it comes to soundtracks. Take 1492 or Chariots of Fire, for example. I'm not saying that technically it's not good in sound, and it's fine, but I just think that soundtracks are really difficult to make interesting without I don't know. I think if you haven't got the visuals to look at and you're not sitting there, particularly if you've got dialogue going on from the film that you don't know the film of, then it's just very difficult. I mean, ask Danny Elfman as an example. It's often repetitive, and that's fine with visuals but not without. So this is a bit lost on me, I'm afraid. Steve?
Yeah, you can get away with having repetitive music if there's enough of a beat so that your foot can tap along with it and it can form a kind of trancey like soundscape. I'm thinking of Tangerine Dream with the soundtrack for Sorcerer, for example. It's very elements of ambient, but also elements of sequencers and faster stuff as well that keeps your interest. But I have to say, Tim, 2 hours of ambient soundscapes. I mean, it's fine sort of playing away in the corner of a room, but I really want 2 hours of my life back if I'm going to listen to it as is. Sorry.
That's fair enough. Well, I can therefore trump that a little bit then.
Good. Go for it.
The last one, which is Stone Roses by Stone Roses. This is the marker point that changed the 1980s to the 1990s for a whole way of music for me. I still like my dance music. I still like my electronic music, but the simple guitar, bass, and drum of this type of music defined a complete era, and I personally think that especially I Am the Resurrection and the break inside the I Am the Resurrection is still, to me, the best 10 minutes of music that I can probably listen to. And it is number 1 on my singles. If I had to have one single, that's the single that it would be. So completely not synthesizer at all. But there you go.
That's an interesting track. You're right. I Am the Resurrection. I listened to that through after what you said in your notes, and the structure of it is really quite interesting. You're absolutely right. And the build up and the way that the song breaks in half. I mean, we're used to lots of songs breaking in half and then kind of tempo changes and all the rest of it. But the way that they do that is quite good. Having said that, I don't like this music. It's too bang crash loud and too many drums and guitars going on for me. Very U2-ish. I felt it really does my head, and I'm sorry. But each their own.
Yeah, this was, as you say, a very significant album in the industry as a whole, and as someone who didn't particularly like the 80s and the synthesizer-dominated Where Are the Guitars era, to have the guitars make a comeback in spectacular fashion, I think was a good move. And in particular, apparently, their Stone Roses helped inspire Noel Gallagher and Liam Gallagher, who were there at the gig, and to help them basically get Oasis going, and that again inspired hundreds of other bands. So there's a lot of legacy here. That jam section in I Am the Resurrection is really impressive. I absolutely agree with you. It's just perfect fusion of rock and jazz and interesting rhythms, interesting energy. Full on. I can't say a bad word about it, but I'm sorry, the singer, genuinely not very good. I'm sorry he cannot sing. And the songwriting is throughout the whole album a bit unspectacular, but they were stood for a moment in time. They were good for who they were. They inspired the right people, and this one track I absolutely agree is stunning.
Yeah.
We're going to move on with our regular slot, Desert Island Disc. But before we do that, just because I have a feeling I'm going to be called away before the end of the show, I'm going to hand over to Ted Salmon to give me my homework for the next show. So what are you going to set me, Ted?
Well, before we go to the setting, we're going to mark last time's homework. Now, last time I set you to listen to an album called Careless Love by Madeleine Peru, if you remember. And it was a bit of a cheat, as I mentioned last time, because I know that you linked to my link in Google Plus about it. So I knew that you kind of must like it.
Yeah.
Lots of interesting jazz and stuff. So how did you get on with that?
Absolutely loved it. Absolutely loved it. I've discovered a new favourite artist. The perfect music for late at night with a beer inside me, chilling with a good book or whatever I'm having to do. But a wonderful vibe, seemingly from a different era, kind of reminds me pre-World War II, but rather than 2004, which was actually what this was. But nothing bad to say about it at all. An essential chill-out album, and it turns out my wife likes it as well. So it's a win all round.
Excellent. I'm pleased that I mentioned that because I really enjoyed that as well, and I didn't long ago find it.
I set for you, Ted, a band called Magazine, a famous band from the late 1970s. The album was called Real Life, and the frontman was Howard Devoto, who has made a name for himself in that era. Rather a peculiar-looking chap, but there were some interesting ideas and a great rhythm section. The whole album is still very exciting to me all these years later. Snarled vocals, great songs, great energy, great guitars, brilliant drumming, the works. One of the best debut albums ever, I reckon.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I do, but it's once again, it's just too much thrash for my poor ears. But I get it that it's interesting and it's more intelligent than your average kind of punk nonsense from a similar era. It reminded me a bit of Echo Belly, which is good. I love the wild piano on the first track. Do you remember when I got you to listen to Aladdin Sane by David Bowie, and it had that wild piano in it? Well, that first track on that album had that stuff going on, and it crossed over into kind of jazz and there was some reggae in there and some prog rock, and there was all sorts of interesting stuff going on. But ultimately, it was just too thrashy for me. Some of the vocals reminded me of The Damned or Sparks. You remember Sparks?
Yeah.
And they were actually very interesting. That the guy's voice, the lead singer, is really, really interesting. He's got a good voice. So lots of nods to Aladdin Sane throughout, and I enjoyed it because of that, and because it became interesting to me to get through and listen to where they were getting their influences from. I wouldn't choose to listen to it, but only because it's too thrashy. But interesting experiment. Thank you,
Tim. Do you remember Magazine?
Yeah, briefly. I must admit I haven't listened to. I probably heard it before. I used to listen to a lot of John Peel back in the day. Yeah. So I'm pretty sure he would have been playing things like that at the time, but nothing recently, I must admit.
Now, my homework for you, Ted, for next week is going to be a Dido Live, and I'm calling it that. I'm not sure it's an official CD release. It was a DVD. I think she was recorded at Brixton Academy, but the DVD, which was absolutely perfection, by the way, included an audio CD, digitally remastered, and from the same audio sources from the soundboard of the same gig. So you had not only a DVD but a CD version. But the special thing is, it's not only got Dido's greatest hits. She really comes across as warm and affectionate with the audience, and the arrangements and the recording quality is absolutely stunning and stellar, and it's a real energy in the recording. So I think you might enjoy this one. It's quite a long album, but got an hour and 20 minutes of Dido Live.
Yeah, I don't mind. I quite like Dido, but I do favour her earlier stuff and certainly her first album. So it will depend on where it comes in from there. But I shall give it a go certainly. And we mentioned Coeur de Pirate earlier in the show. And I'm going to set you homework for this particular female artist, this Canadian French singer and pianist. And the album is her debut album, which is called Coeur de Pirate, and it's a delightful, charming album. All of it sung in French, and there's something engaging about that in a kind of Edith Piaf kind of way, and it's just really nice, even though you can't understand what she's saying, well, unless you can speak French. There's a real kind of lovely voice and wonderful musical arrangement. So you've already said that you kind of like the sound of that earlier on. So I'm going to give you a whole album. And it's a short album, actually. It's only 31 minutes, but it's a very, very good, engaging kind of listen.
Je sais la cute. Or something like that. Moving on swiftly, I'm going to have to disappear in about 2 minutes, so I'm going to hand this over to Ted to host this bit. But basically, this is the Desert Island disc section. If you had one album you could listen to that would keep you going for months on end on a desert island, what would it be? So I'm going to say goodbye. Have a good rest of the show, guys, and take it away, Ted.
Okay, thank you, and goodbye to Steve. So, Tim, we're going to ask you, if you were stuck on a desert island, what one piece of music, song, album, whatever, would you like to have with you to just so you didn't get bored? It's got to be good for repetition, obviously, because that's all you've got. What would it be?
Well, now you've just said all of that, I'm not so sure. So what I put down was Disintegration by The Cure. And there's like all of the stuff that I've picked, there is a story behind them. And first of all, Disintegration is what I think is the best album ever. It's the one that, if I had to pick out, it's the only album, for example, where I've bought that vinyl 3 times over because I've managed to have my girlfriend at the time steal a copy of it, or then another one's got too many scratches on it or whatever, and I've had CDs that have gone south, and DVD or whatever it may be. Now it is just, to me, the epitome of a group that I've loved ever since their first album up to whatever they do now. But I just love that album, and every track on it I'll be quite happy to keep. However, the track on it that I find that I like the most is probably the most upbeat of the tracks, which is Fascination Street. And I don't know, maybe it's because it was associated with, I think it was associated with the Breakfast Club or something back in the 80s, right, yeah, when it was first there. So, and I like that. But now you said about repetition, and I'm just reading into some notes and things like that. Maybe I'm not so sure now. I'm not so sure. Maybe ask me again in a month's time or something.
Yeah.
Because,
or maybe I'll ask you before we sign off, and you can have a think about it for a few minutes.
Yeah,
The Cure. I found that The Cure was I always wanted to be a fan of The Cure, and I love Robert Smith's voice. I think it's really distinctive and interesting, and he does wacky and interesting things with it in this kind of post-punk era. You know. Musically, they're all really accomplished artists, I think, and that comes through, and they've just got interesting. I don't know if it's just Robert Smith driving it, but there are interesting ideas going on, and musically it's just interesting. Why I didn't get into it was a bit like the punk thing I was saying earlier, because it's part of a kind of Vogue set that was associated with this kind of gothic movement, and I suppose I didn't really want to be stuck into that group of social set. Yeah, which definitely is a shame, because and because of that I don't know the albums, and I only know some of the hits, and I just think it's a lovely kind of thing to want to like, but I never quite got there.
Absolutely. But to me, that's one of the reasons, I suppose, as I said, everybody's musical taste is defined but when they grow up. But the 80s had so many different, I mean, you talk about what albums you want. I miss off things from there which are completely different, like two-tone or ska or reggae albums, which I loved at the time as well. And mod albums like from The Jam or people like that, which are all amazing songs from that period of time as well. And you're right about things like The Cure, because at the time it was seen as being a bit gothic, a bit like Sisters of Mercy or Killing Joke or something like that. But you do, again, I was sort of part of that set of people, so I fell into it, and that's what you listen to an awful lot. But you're absolutely right. Now, today, feeling like a bit of an old fogey in my 50s, hopefully not too much. When I look at modern music today, and one of the questions that you asked me was, what modern music do you listen to? I find it very difficult to see differentiation in modern music nowadays. So an album like Disintegration by a group that looks like The Cure is very different. Now, I'm sure a lot of people who are in their 20s or whatever, early 20s, could actually ring in now or write in now and say, hey, wait a minute, what about groups like the 1975 or some others or whatever, and that they're a bit different or whatever. I'm sure that they are. I just don't seem to see so much of it. And maybe that's just the sign of our times with our modern YouTube and communications and the instant ability to listen to anything anywhere. You don't get hooked on something so much. But I just got hooked on that all the time. And I managed to find ways of associating tracks on that album to everything that was happening in my life. And again, the theme that's running through all of this is being dumped by girlfriends or getting into all of that, because of course when you're early 20s, for me anyway, my whole life just revolved around essentially going to college and hooking up with girls. That was basically what I was doing. So every piece of music was around that, you see.
And that's, we keep coming back to that theme, and everyone's music is stuck in where they grew up. You're absolutely right. The what we should perhaps do next time you come onto the show, if you want to come back, Tim, is to say to you, right, you've got to have one album or one piece of music from each decade.
No, that's different. Yeah, that's different. I could do that. I could do that quite happily, because if it was the 70s, even though I love Nevermind the Bollocks, if it was the 70s, it's probably going to be a David Bowie album. Yeah. If it's the 80s, it's probably going to be The Cure. If it's the 90s, it's probably going to be something very abstract. I think I can't see that's it. I can't think of anything from the 90s unless it's something like Britpop or something. But as we get into the noughties and into this decade, then I'm a little bit closer then, because there are groups at the moment like the Double X and I said 1975 and groups like that, which sound to me an awful lot like 80s groups. Right. And I can pick things from now a lot easier.
Well, let's move there, shall we? Because in the current scene, we'll go back to the stuff about what you listen on in a minute. But in your current scene, you said a couple of things that you do listen to now. Do you want to just highlight those?
Yeah, so I mentioned some of the groups, but what I do listen to is I'm swayed by I think, again, good electronic music, and there's a couple of things that I've listened to recently. So, but on the abstract side, as I put down in my notes, I'm a big fan of Twin Peaks and of David Lynch and his films and his art. And the recent, if you're a fan of Twin Peaks, you'll know that the third series of Twin Peaks has just finished after 25 years. And each episode, if you haven't seen it, has a middle piece where they have a group actually do a complete live number. Oh, right. So there's an entire song played either at the end of each episode or in the middle. So, for example, groups like Nine Inch Nails get to do, and now Nine Inch Nails, of course, is a very electro gothic guitar heavy-ish type of group, which is again a 1980s group actually. That's where they started, and then Au revoir Simone, which is just three girls with synthesizers playing a plink plink plonk plonk type of song, which is to me a beautiful thing, and it's all very up to date and all very modern, but that's that sort of thing I really love. But on the other side, I like just trying to find new music. So the internet is brilliant for this. So Beats One is something I listen to as a radio station quite a lot. But there are some great podcasts out there. Not as good as your podcast, Ted, but there are some brilliant podcasts out there for music as well. And one that I listen to from a guy that I subscribe to over in Seattle is one called Random Thoughts, which is all about remixes and something that's really close to my heart called Mashup, which is taking maybe older songs and removing the vocals and putting new vocals on from songs of today, or vice versa, or whatever it may be. So things like that. And then there's a whole group of different songs and different DJs out there producing something called Booty, which is all around the world actually, especially in London at Heaven nightclub, and in San Francisco and Los Angeles. They do every month. They do these big mashup like DJ sets, and you can download their stuff and mix it yourself. And there's various products, and we don't have time to talk about it today, but various tools that allow you to do that as well. So I quite like to make my own stuff as I go as well. So so that sort of thing. So I do listen to a lot of new stuff. The only thing about the new stuff is that you don't tend to get albums of good new stuff from one person or something. Right. Not to me anyway. Most of the good new stuff comes in just a 12-inch signal or the equivalent of or whatever it is. So that's how it is to me anyway.
Yeah. You'll probably be interested in that thing I mentioned at the beginning from John Campion about the Kraftwerk thing that someone's kind of doing just that with. Yeah,
love Kraftwerk, and Kraftwerk is one of the favourite mashup scenes because you can take Kraftwerk music, you can take Kraftwerk synthesizers and sequences out and put them behind all sorts of tracks. And if I think there is a documentary on Apple Music called 808. And again, it's slightly, if Steve was here, he would probably be out of this piece as well. But 808 is the name of the 808 drum machine from Roland, which was very popular at the end of the 70s and the early 80s, and created music. A lot of music, dance music, was created using that. But also a lot of music was remixed in with things like Kraftwerk and things like that back in the early 80s using technology like that. And there's some great tracks from back there. And there are still great tracks today from Kraftwerk. I tried to get tickets to see Kraftwerk at Oxford a couple of months ago, and they were sold out within like 10 seconds or something. Wow. So I didn't get to go and see that. Again, one of my favourites, and I could easily have one of their albums in here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And a link in the show notes to Twin Peaks, and also to Random Thoughts, and also to Booty Mashup.
That's right.
So now I'm really interested in what you brought to share with regards to how you listen to stuff, because one of the first of these things looks absolutely amazing. I'm stunned. People have got to click in the show notes to look at this. Tell us all about it.
So when you asked me if I would like to come on, and I said to you, I think in the email, well, you hear people like Gavin and you guys or whatever, you talk about your fancy stuff, your fancy headphones and audiophile things. I love music, but I'm probably a little bit different because first of all, I've got a studio, and I've got a studio with proper monitors and things like that coming from a mixing board, a very small mixing board, which leads back to my first job when I worked for Apple, and I worked in a lot of media studios, recording studios. Right. So I got a lot of free stuff, stuff they were going to throw out, sort of things. Okay. So that my headphones and things like that are about 20 years old, and I've got microphones that are all that sort of age and whatever. But what I didn't have when I was younger and I was growing up, I didn't have enough money to buy anything decent. So I, like probably an awful lot of people when they went to college, had a really crappy black plastic ghetto blaster or boombox for the sake of it, with all of those super duper dials on it for the equalizers and all of the lights on it and that sort of thing. And it was made by Alba or somebody. Now, I'm not trying to insult anybody. Yeah, Bush. There you go. But I enviously, in the first college where I was staying, the guy next door to me had this something called a VZ2000 by Sharp. And it's a turntable, an upright turntable ghetto blaster. So it is a cassette player, multi signal, so short wave, long wave, medium wave, and an upright deck which can play both sides. So there's actually two styluses going in opposite directions to each other. Yeah, and so one of them comes down on the record and plays it, and then the other one picks up and plays it from the other side without turning the record over. And this thing cost an absolute fortune back in 1982 or something, and I could never afford it. And I used to go into his room and listen to the Clash constantly because he loved the Clash, and that's all we listened to. But I would happily sit there and watch the turntable just turning round. And when I vowed to myself back then that when I could afford one, I was going to get one. You forward wind into 2011, 2012, and I'm walking past and my house is normal and whatever, and my wife thinks I'm normal, and I'm walking past a charity shop, and sitting in the window is one of those ghetto blasters. Okay. And I just say, that's it, I'm buying it. And it didn't work. The turntable didn't work. The cassette drive was melted. There was nothing there. And I spent about 2 weeks in my office just trying to put it all back together again. I didn't know what I was doing, but eventually I managed to get it working. Wow. And it just started an obsession of boomboxes. And I no longer have a stereo, if you will. I don't have an amplifier. I used to have NAD equipment mostly, but I don't have any of that anymore. I got rid of it all. And what I do is I have old ghetto blasters, which I've hopefully fixed. Most of the time you have to fix them because as you probably are aware, with cassette decks, they have the drive belts. Over time, those drive belts actually melt into like a viscous black sludge that you have to take it completely apart and clean them out with alcohol and all sorts of things. Right. And so I've got a VZ2000, which is the one I was looking for. That's my turntable in the living room. In my gym, I've got a gym, it's sort of semi-office gym. I've got something called a GF777, which has got 4 massive speakers, 2 subs, 2 tweeters, 2 main speakers on there, twin cassette deck, and it's a monster, an absolute monster. Takes 12 the big batteries. I can't remember what they are. Just A batteries? I'm not sure. D cells. Yeah. That's it. And then in my camper van, I've got something called a JBC-M70, which is, by most people, aficionados of these things, say it's probably one of the best sounding ghetto blasters out there. And in my office where I'm sitting now, connected to an Echo Dot, I've got what and most people say anyway, the holy grail of these things, which is a JVC M90, which again, and if you look at ones that are fully restored, all of mine I've restored or bought restored. They are incredible bits of equipment for me. And when you connect them up to something modern, all of mine are connected up to Echo Dots at the moment. I've got a Google Mini, which I'm going to give a go. In fact, no, that doesn't have an audio out, so I won't be using that. But one of the new Echoes has got another one, so I'm going to try that. Okay. And yeah, I use all of these, and all around my house, I think they're like works of art. And the other bit that I have, because again, obviously I'm stuck in the 80s on this. I have in fact, this is the 70s. I've got I record a lot of my stuff on reel to reel tape. So I've got a big TIAC reel to reel, which I record on
yeah.
as well. That's a 4-track. So, so I like to record and I like to listen on the old stuff. You see, that's what I like. And of course, I can upset the neighbours because they're so loud. They are.
Yeah, they look fantastic. And yes, I completely remember these things. And like you, at the time, I probably couldn't think about affording them. And then, unlike you, as time went on, I guess I went with the flow, and my brain moved on as well and left these behind. Because modern stuff kind of did different things, and we were moving towards the stuff that we know we can do now. But yeah, it's a great hobby. I mean, I'm really jealous of all those lights and knobs and whistles and everything.
And it's like I said, especially with things like the VZ2000, and I've got its brother, which is the VZ2500, which looks a little bit more modern. You put a picture disc in there, you can see the disc through the turntable, so you can see it playing. And I've got an LED light which I've placed just behind it, so if you darken the room, you can see the vinyl turning round and playing. But again, it's not just to sort of like come back from it a little bit. It's not high quality, even though things like the M90 is extraordinarily good. It wouldn't take the place of some fantastic floor standing speakers, and a £2,000 or I mean, God knows how much money you want to spend on an amplifier or whatever. It's not that, but you can pick it up and take it to a different room and switch it on, or you can take it outside and turn it on, and there's the barbecue. And with your background as well, that you like to listen to music. You're not particularly keen on getting your Bluetooth speaker out or something like that. Those little speakers, things like jam boxes, which are great, but these I'll happily. And the best thing about it is because they've all got FM radio receivers. Right. If you get an FM radio transmitter, which you can just get for like £10 or something, you can have them all playing the same thing at the same time perfectly. So if you really want to create a wall of sound, I can have them all play at the same time straight from my phone or from my iPod or whatever it may be. Wow. Because they all play on FM. And of course, with FM on full stereo, the quality of the FM radios in them are amazing. So, the odd party or something like that can always sound pretty good.
Really good stuff. I've got back into vinyl, as I was saying on this show a few shows ago, and I started to build up a collection over the last 3 or 4 years. And I did notice that Project Pro-Ject, who make turntables, have produced one that's an upright one. And you look at this thing and you think, good grief, how on earth does that work? Yeah. And that's just playing on one side. This thing has got, as you say, 2 styluses, both sides. And I do vaguely remember these being out there at the time. But it's a wonderful kind of piece of technology, really. Even though, as you say, it's outdated and it's not very good quality. But, this is really interesting stuff, I think.
Yeah, and you can get it. I mean, eBay is your friend on these things. But as with all of these things, you can get absolute rubbish. You can probably pick up a VZ for £100 or something in not working order, and then you don't know what you're going to find. And you probably get a good one for £400. The M90, the Holy Grail one, a bad one in bad condition is £1,000, and that's not working. So a good one in good condition is now creeping up to 3,000 to 4,000. For these systems, only because they're so old and you can't find replacement bits for them. And again, they're like you said, if you're an analog person and you like the little dials and that sort of stuff and the buttons and things. If you're like me, you want them all to work. I'm terrible for that sort of thing. I can't just buy something and have it not working. I have to try and fix it. And I will spend hours and I'll spend a lot of time and effort trying to get it working. So I have to be a bit careful about it. But with vinyl coming back in a big way, although it's so expensive. Oh no. I'm stunned at the moment about the cost of new vinyl, because I've collected vinyl all my life. I've got quite a lot of different things, and I don't envy you if you're traveling around or whatever, having to carry a vinyl collection around with you. That would be tough love, in my opinion.
No, all of the records I have bought so far have been stored by my family, and I'm unable to enjoy them, which is a real shame.
Yeah.
But if you had something like this, then you could kind of take 10 albums with you and put them. Don't take the sleeves, but just store them, somewhere safe with the inner sleeves, and you could still enjoy them.
Yeah, absolutely, and listen to the scratches and the And I've got two of them. You see, I've got the VZ 2000. I've got, like I said, I've got its brother, the VZ 2000 2500, which is slightly different, same sort of idea, which I've fixed. And on that one, I've got War of the Worlds. From Crikey, I don't know when War of the Worlds was released. Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds.
Yeah.
And that album is so scratched, but it still sounds amazing when you're sitting in a smallish room, and it can project pretty well into the room and things like that. So they've got a lot of character about them. But again,
yes.
You'd wipe the floor with it with probably a modern £200 or £300 new system, I would have thought.
Yeah, that's true of many things, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, with cameras or with, hi-fi units, as you say, or loads of other stuff. But there's something about a hobby element involved here, and just doing something because you want to and it's enjoyable.
Absolutely.
So good for you, and thank you for sharing that.
That's okay.
Links in the show notes to all of those. I did a bit of research and tracked down some links to those particular items. So do have a look at those and follow those through. Thank you very much, Tim, for coming on. You've been great and very engaging for the podcast today. Tell me, before you go, where can people track you down online?
So my Twitter is SLAGURU, so Slaggaroo, and there's a story behind it, but I'm not going to tell you that now. That's been out there for a long time. I'm on, for those of you that haven't heard me before, I do a lot of phone stuff as well. My job is to do with phones, so I do keep up to date with the phone stuff on PSC, so I'm on the Google forums there as well.
Very good. And talking of which, all the other stuff that Steve and I are involved with in terms of audio podcasts is at Pod Hub UK. So head across to that, which you can get to via Google search or through Steve's website, stevelitchfield.com. You'll find the show notes for this show, links to all the albums that Tim's been talking about, and lots more in the show notes. So head across there and grab them. We'll be back in the middle of kind of December, hopefully. If you want to come on the show and be a guest with us, please do give us a shout. You know how to get hold of us. But in the meantime, do keep going across to the community and telling us what you're listening to. But for now, that's it. Goodbye, and goodbye from Steve in his absence. You've been listening to Chewing Gum for the Years.